This is a fictional story, created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, names, places, or events is purely coincidental. My parents called investing in me stupid and funded my cousin's hotel instead. But when she went bankrupt and I became successful, they called begging for money. You know that thing families do where they act like they are this united, solid team, but there is always an invisible scoreboard that nobody talks about? That was my family. From the outside, we looked stable and successful, the kind of people neighbors pointed to when they wanted to say, "See, they did everything right." My father ran a construction company with his name on trucks around town. My mother managed a small portfolio of rental properties. Money was never just money in that house. It was proof of character and proof of who deserved respect. They believed in real work, things you could touch, concrete, keys, cash in a drawer. I was the kid in the corner taking apart old computers and fixing the Wi-Fi, which in their eyes made me helpful, but not exactly impressive. When I was 16, my father's company network got hit with a nasty malware issue. I stayed up most of the night following tutorials, changing settings, restoring backups until everything was running again. He thanked me in the same tone he used when I took out the trash. A week later, my cousin organized a school fundraiser selling cookies in the parking lot, and he spent an entire dinner calling it natural entrepreneurship and talking about how some people were just born with business in their blood. I understood exactly where I stood in that invisible hierarchy. Meanwhile, I was teaching myself about networks, firewalls, and data breaches because those things made sense to me in a way family dinners never did. By the time I finished college, I had this tiny, stubborn idea growing inside me that I could actually build something of my own. I studied cybersecurity and compliance, spent years obsessing over how companies protect their data, and I started seeing all the gaps that small and medium businesses had. They were terrified of big fines, terrified of getting hacked, and totally clueless about how to prevent it. I knew there was a market for someone who could walk in, explain things in normal language, and actually fix the mess before it turned into a disaster. I did not want to work forever for people who treated my work like some mystical magic trick. I wanted my own clients, my own team, my own decisions. So I did what my parents always told me we should do. I made a plan, a real one. I put together this whole presentation with market research, projected revenue, examples of businesses that had paid ridiculous penalties because they did not take compliance seriously. And I built a step-by-step outline for a consulting company that would specialize in data security and regulatory requirements for regular businesses, not just giant corporations. I even included a repayment schedule, because I knew if I did not, they would accuse me of being irresponsible. I was asking them for a loan with interest, not a gift, not a handout, a loan. We scheduled a family meeting at the house, and I went into it nervous but hopeful. I showed up early, wearing a blazer that felt a little too stiff on my shoulders, with my laptop and printed copies of my slides because apparently I still believed that if I were prepared enough, they would finally see me as an adult. My mother had her serious talk face on, the one she used whenever bills or tenant problems came up, and my father was leaning back in his chair like he was about to watch a performance. My cousin's name came up in the conversation before I had even opened my laptop, with my father saying something about taking inspiration from how she handled her business plans. That should have been my first sign that this would not end well. I walked them through everything. I explained the demand, the risk for companies that did not comply with regulations, the way fines could shut down entire operations overnight. I talked about how I could start small, focus on local companies, expand as I built a reputation, and eventually offer training and ongoing monitoring for a monthly fee. I mentioned the friends I wanted to bring in as partners, both of them from my field, both serious, hardworking people who were willing to invest their own savings. I showed them everything. The loan structure, the repayment plan, the interest I would pay over the years. I even included a conservative scenario and an optimistic one. When I finished, there was this quiet moment where I really believed they were impressed. My mother was flipping through the pages with that frown she gets when she is concentrating, and my father was tapping his fingers on the table. Then he leaned forward and said, "It is a nice idea, but this is not a real business, Anna." Just like that. Not a real business. He started explaining how consulting is unstable and how it is all based on reputation, and how if a couple of clients decide to pull out, everything collapses. He said there is too much risk in something intangible, and that it would be irresponsible for them to tie up money in something they did not understand. My mother added that she did not see any assets they could seize if something went wrong. That was the word she used, seize. Like I was already defaulting on something that did not exist yet. They said I should get more experience, save more money, and maybe in a few years I could try something smaller, like a support service or tutoring. They said I was smart, but they did not think I was ready to run a company, and that it was better to have a stable job than to chase some idea I had put together on my laptop. The whole time they were talking, I could feel my throat tightening, because this was not just about the money. This was about every dinner, every comment, every time they had made it clear that I was not the one they believed in. I thanked them for listening, tried to keep my voice steady, gathered my printed copies, and went back to my tiny apartment feeling like I had just been told in a very polite way that my dreams were cute, but not meant for real life. About a month later, we had this big family wedding weekend for one of my cousins, the one they always said was born to be a businesswoman. If my parents had a favorite outside of their own children, it was her. The wedding was over the top in the way only my family can pull off when they want to show off. There were flowers everywhere, a band, a fancy rehearsal dinner, and an entire brunch the next morning. I spent most of it doing polite small talk with relatives who only remembered me as the one with the computers. Nobody asked about my presentation. Nobody asked if I had moved forward with anything. It was like that meeting never happened. The real punch in the stomach came at the reception, during one of those awkward moments when the microphone passes around and people start making speeches that were not on the program. My cousin took the mic, thanked everyone for coming, made a joke about how stressful wedding planning is, and then turned to my parents with this big smile. She said she wanted to give a special thank you to them for believing in her project and supporting the hotel from day one. She said she would not have been able to launch it without their financial help, and that she would work every day to honor that trust. I swear I felt the room tilt for a second. I was standing near the buffet table holding a tiny plate of salad I did not even want, and I just froze. My parents were smiling and laughing and waving like this was the most natural thing in the world. I watched my father raise his glass while my cousin kept talking about the hotel they were opening near a popular tourist area, and how it was going to be this modern, cozy place that felt like home. People clapped. My mother dabbed at the corner of her eyes like she was emotional, and I just stood there thinking, you had money for that. You had money for a hotel, but you did not have money for me. I stepped out onto the patio pretending I needed some air, which was technically true because I felt like I could not breathe. I leaned against this cold stone wall and stared out at the parking lot lights, listening to the muffled music coming through the doors. It was not just the money that hurt. It was the confirmation that they were perfectly capable of making a big financial move. They just refused to do it for me. For them, hotel rooms and a restaurant and a lobby you could walk into were real. My services, my brain, my work were all just this fuzzy concept they could not respect. I was somewhere between crying and dissociating when my grandmother found me. She is one of those people who can read a room from across it, and apparently she had read my face from the other side of the dance floor. She sat down beside me on this uncomfortable bench and said very softly, "Are you going to tell me what you are doing hiding out here?" I tried to brush it off, said I was just tired, but she knows me. After about 30 seconds, she asked, "Is this about the hotel?" And that was it. The dam broke. I told her everything. I told her about the presentation, about the loan request, about how carefully I had planned it out, about the way my father had turned it into a lecture about real businesses. I told her how much it hurt to hear my cousin thank them for a loan like it was nothing. I admitted that it was not jealousy of my cousin's success. It was the pattern. It was the fact that they never saw me the way they saw her. My grandmother listened quietly, hands folded on her lap, nodding every once in a while, asking a question here and there just to make sure she understood the details. When I ran out of words, she let out this long breath and said, "I have been watching this for a very long time." She told me that sometimes people invest in what feels familiar, not in what is actually the smartest. She said my father saw himself in my cousin with her hotel and her real estate dreams, because he had built his life on physical buildings. She said it did not mean I was less capable, only that I scared them a little because they did not understand what I wanted to build. She squeezed my hand and said I had every right to feel hurt, but that their blindness did not cancel out my talent. I almost cried again when she said that. The next afternoon, after the tired farewell brunch where everyone pretended there was no tension, my phone rang while I was sitting on my couch surrounded by laundry I had meant to fold. It was my grandfather. He never called me directly unless something was serious. He usually just passed the phone to my grandmother. He said he wanted me to come over, that he needed to talk to me in person. Hearing his voice like that made my heart pound. I drove over there in this weird mix of dread and curiosity, rehearsing all the possible conversations we could be about to have. When I walked into their house, my grandmother hugged me like we had not just seen each other the day before, and my grandfather was already in his small office with papers laid out neatly on his desk. He did not waste time with small talk. He said, "Your grandmother told me about your idea," and then motioned for me to sit. I sat on the same chair where I used to do puzzles as a kid, and suddenly my entire future was being discussed on that piece of furniture. He asked me to walk him through the plan again, but in my own words, without slides or charts. So I did. I explained what I wanted to do, what kind of clients I would target, how the contracts would work, how long I thought it would take before the company could stand on its own feet. I told him about the friends I wanted to bring in, about our savings and how far they would get us. He listened carefully, nodding, asking smart questions, not about whether this was real, but about how I would handle specific risks. It felt like the first time in a long time that an older person in my family talked to me like I knew what I was doing. Then he told me his story. I had heard parts of it before, but never with this much detail. He started his own business years ago with almost nothing, just some borrowed tools and a loan from an uncle who everyone thought was crazy for giving him money. He said people at the time thought his idea was reckless, that there was no guarantee it would work, but that one person believing in him had changed everything. He said he could not claim to understand all the technical parts of what I wanted to do, but he understood risk, and he understood hard work. He had already talked to a lawyer, he said. He had already moved some things around. He slid a folder across the desk toward me, and inside was a draft of a loan agreement. It was not enough to cover everything I had dreamed of, but it was enough to get us started in a small office with basic equipment. The loan had interest, a real rate, repayment terms, all written out. He said he wanted this to be professional, not a family favor, because he did not want anyone later to say I had manipulated them or taken advantage of them. My throat closed up. I do not even know if I answered him right away. I just remember staring at those pages and feeling, for the first time, like someone was putting actual, literal money behind the idea that I was capable. I cried in front of him, obviously. He patted my shoulder, a little awkwardly, and said, "Just do the work. Anna, do not stop when it gets hard." That was what he asked in exchange. Not loyalty, not blind obedience, just effort. I signed the papers a week later, we finalized the details, and just like that, I had the starting capital my parents had said was too risky to waste on someone like me. I called my 2 friends from college, the ones I had been daydreaming with about starting something together, and told them it was happening. We sat in my tiny living room surrounded by takeout containers and drafted our own partnership agreement on a laptop, arguing over job titles and responsibilities like kids playing company, even though it was very real. We found a small, somewhat depressing office above a nail salon in a strip of older buildings that smelled like chemicals and old carpet. But it was cheap and the landlord did not ask a lot of questions. We split responsibilities the way we did in school projects, just with higher stakes. One friend leaned into sales and client relationships. Another focused totally on the technical audits and documentation, and I tried to glue everything together. I handled finances, proposals, project timelines, and anything that did not fit neatly in someone else's job. We bought secondhand desks, used our own laptops, and decorated the place with plants we hoped would not die in 2 weeks. We gave the company a neutral, serious name that did not include any of our own because we wanted clients to take us seriously. Those first years were brutal. I am not going to pretend we were some entrepreneurial fairy tale. We worked ridiculous hours, living on coffee and whatever food we could reheat in a microwave that probably should have been retired a decade ago. I had meetings with potential clients during the day, and then stayed up late writing policies and procedures and proposals. We did free workshops at local business groups, trying to explain why compliance was not optional, why they needed us before something went wrong, not after. A lot of people nodded politely and then ignored us. Our first real break came when a medium-sized financial company in town had an incident they could not sweep under the rug. Nothing that made the news, but bad enough that they heard loud and clear from regulators that they needed to clean up their mess. Someone who knew someone who had attended one of our free workshops passed along our name, and suddenly I was sitting in a conference room with a bunch of nervous executives asking me if I could help them avoid being destroyed. We poured everything into that project. We reviewed their systems, documented their gaps, rewrote their policies, trained their staff, and stayed in their offices until late at night, sometimes finishing sessions in rooms that the cleaning crews were already trying to vacuum. When they finally paid us, after pushing the invoice right up to the due date, because finances backed up, the money covered a better office and the salary of our first full-time employee. It also gave us one very precious thing, a strong reference. While all of this was happening, my parents were going through their own version of times are tough, except when they talked about it, they were always the victims of the market, never the authors of their bad decisions. The hotel that they had helped my cousin fund was not exactly the instant hit they had imagined. There were delays, extra costs, issues with contractors, and a lot of wishful thinking. I heard things in passing, little comments about occupancy rates and promotions and unforeseen expenses, but nobody ever sat me down to talk about it. I just watched from a distance while my business slowly grew and theirs struggled. We hit a near breaking point about 2 years in when one of our biggest clients delayed a huge payment for what felt like forever. We had hired based on that contract, taken on more office space, and suddenly we were staring at our accounts and realizing we could not make payroll and rent at the same time if that money did not come in. I spent nights staring at spreadsheets, trying not to throw up from the stress. One afternoon, in the middle of that chaos, one of my partners snapped at me, saying I had overpromised and dragged them into something that was going to collapse. We had this long, ugly argument in the office, voices raised, door closed, both of us saying things we regretted within minutes. She said she was thinking about selling her share and cutting her losses. I said that if she wanted to bail, she should just say it and stop acting like I had tricked her. It got personal. It got mean. If you are imagining a professional disagreement, you are still picturing it too politely. This was raw and messy and filled with all the fear we were both trying not to show. We held on by the thinnest thread. The client finally paid. After what felt like an eternity of "we are processing," and we were able to breathe again. We made changes after that, tightened how we structured payments, stopped letting clients drag us around just because they were bigger than we were. But that scare left a mark. It reminded me that my grandfather's loan was not a magic shield. We could still lose everything if we were not careful. It also made me more protective of what we were building, more aware that every decision had a cost. By the time we reached the 4 or 5 year mark, roughly 2 years before everything shut down in that first pandemic year, things actually looked stable for once. Almost like what I had imagined that day at my parents' table. We had a small but solid team, contracts with companies that paid on time, referrals coming in without us begging for them. We opened a second, even slightly less depressing office in a nearby city because the demand was there, and we finally had a buffer in our bank account that did not disappear the second rent was due. I used that money to do the thing I had been thinking about since I signed those papers in my grandfather's office. I paid them back. We had a small, slightly awkward but emotional meeting with just the 3 of us, my grandparents and me, at their dining table. I brought a check for the full amount of the loan plus every dollar of interest that had been agreed on. I laid out a simple summary of my finances, not because they asked, but because I wanted them to see that this was real, that their faith in me had actually turned into something tangible. My grandfather read over the numbers slowly, nodded, and then looked up at me with this expression that made my chest tighten. Pride, relief, something like that. He tried to joke that he was going to miss the regular payments because they made him feel like a banker, but I could tell this moment was important to him. My grandmother cried. They do that thing where they pretend they are both fine, and then one of them wipes their face and the other pretends not to notice. After that, I helped them move into a smaller place closer to clinics and grocery stores, because the house they had was way too big for them to manage, especially with some health issues creeping in. I paid the difference. Not as a grand gesture, just as a quiet thank you. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. Meanwhile, the hotel was barely staying above water. Then the pandemic hit, the one that shut down everything for months and made people cancel trips, events, anything that involved being in the same building as strangers. My cousin's hotel relied on tourists and business travel. Suddenly there were no tourists, and business travel became video calls and emails. My parents had already poured more money into the place, trying to help my cousin keep it afloat. They had guaranteed loans, taken on more debt, convinced themselves that if they just pushed through, things would bounce back. They did not. The hotel closed. Officially, it was temporary, but we all knew what that meant. My mother called me not long after that news started to spread, and I could hear it in her voice before she even said the words. She started by talking about how hard the times were, how nobody could have predicted any of this, how it was unfair. Then she said they were a little short for some bank payments and asked if I could help out with a loan, just for a few months. I asked questions. How much did they need? What was the plan? What were they willing to offer as collateral? You would think I had insulted her. She got offended that I was treating it like a business conversation and reminded me that they were my parents. My father got on the phone and went straight to guilt. He said, "After everything we have done for you, the least you can do is help us get through this." He said my business would not even exist without the example they set. He said families support each other. I told him no. Not instantly, not coldly, but clearly. I said my company had its own obligations, that we had employees depending on us, and that I was not going to jeopardize that to cover a hole he had dug by making a risky investment he never asked my opinion about. I said I was sorry for what they were going through, but I was not their bank. The silence on the other end of the line was thick. Then he said, "You really are ungrateful," and hung up. We did not talk for a while after that. At least, I did not talk to them directly. I heard about them through relatives, through my grandmother, through occasional passive-aggressive posts on a social media app where my mother complained about how modern children only cared about money. It was all very vague, nothing that named me directly, but everyone understood who she was talking about. I tried to focus on my work, on my friends, on my grandparents. I tried to convince myself that once the dust settled, maybe we could talk again like adults. Then came my grandparents' wedding anniversary. The big one, the kind that people make a big deal about with speeches and slideshows and all that. My grandparents were celebrating 50 years together, which is impressive, especially considering the circus the family had turned into. I offered to organize the event, partly because I wanted to do something for them, partly because I needed to feel like I was capable of giving them a better day than the chaos around them. We booked a nice event space at a local hotel, the kind of place my cousin probably would have scoffed at when she was still convinced her place would be the new favorite in town. I paid for the food, worked with the staff, picked out decorations, tried to make it feel warm and celebratory without turning it into a fake fairy tale. People showed up ready to drink, eat, and tell stories about the couple that had somehow held everything together all those years. For most of the night, I managed to ignore my parents. They were there, of course, dressed up like nothing was wrong, smiling that tight smile you wear when you want everyone to think you are still winning. I caught them a few times at the edge of my vision, talking to other guests, gesturing around the room like they were explaining something important. I did my jobs, made sure my grandparents were comfortable, checked on the food, laughed at stories. I told myself I could survive a few hours of pretending everything was fine. At some point, though, I started catching bits of conversations that made my jaw clench. My parents were telling people about my business. Not in a proud but truthful way, but in this rewritten version of history where they had been my mentors, my guiding lights, my investors in spirit, if not in cash. I heard my father telling one couple that he had encouraged me to take the leap into consulting because he saw that I had a head for business. I heard my mother say that we had long talks about risk and responsibility when I was starting out. At one point, my father even implied that they had helped with early costs. That one nearly made my eye twitch. I moved closer, pretending I needed to grab something from a nearby table, just so I could confirm I was not hallucinating. But no, they really were claiming my story as part of their legacy, as if the loan they gave my cousin had somehow emotionally applied to me as well. It was one thing to refuse to support me when I needed it, and then ask me to bail them out later. It was another to stand in a room full of people and pretend they had been the reason I succeeded. I had written out a small, safe speech for the celebration. It had a couple of jokes, some sweet memories, and a simple toast to my grandparents. Nothing controversial, nothing sharp. Standing there, though, listening to my father brag about his business advice, I felt something inside me snap. I kept my face neutral, helped my grandmother to her seat near the center of the room, waited for the informal speeches to wind down, and then took the microphone when someone called my name. At first, I stuck to the plan. I talked about how my grandparents had met, how they carried each other through hard times, how their house had always felt like a safe place. People laughed at a few light-hearted stories, clapped at the mention of 50 years together. Then I shifted. I said that my grandparents had taught me something important about what it means to really believe in someone. Not just with words, but with actual support when it counts. I talked about how years ago I had gone to people I loved and respected with a business idea and a detailed plan, and how I had been told it was too risky, too intangible, too unrealistic. I did not name my parents, but I did not have to. The air changed. Then I said that my grandparents had listened, had asked questions, and had decided to back me, not because they fully understood what I was doing, but because they knew who I was. I said that without their loan, their trust, and their insistence on treating me like a capable adult, my company would not exist. I thanked them for putting their money where their belief was, for signing actual documents, for taking a risk on me when the safer choice would have been to keep their savings untouched. I said they were the reason I was able to pay them back with interest, and still have a business that allowed me to help them now. I ended the speech with a toast specifically to them, calling them the only people in my family who ever truly backed me when it mattered. The room was quiet in that way where everybody understands what is being said with all the words that are not actually spoken. My parents were stone still. My cousin looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. My grandmother's eyes were wet again, but this time her expression was complicated, a mix of pride and discomfort. I stepped down, handed the microphone back, and tried to act like my heart was not pounding in my ears. I knew I had just lit a match. I was not sure how big the fire was going to get. It did not take long to find out. Maybe 15 minutes later, I was near the dessert table checking on the cake, when my father walked up to me with the kind of smile that could cut glass. He leaned in and said through his teeth, "Was that really necessary?" I asked him what he meant, even though we both knew. He said I had humiliated him and my mother in front of everyone, that I had made them look like selfish people who had never done anything for me. I told him I had simply told the truth. I said I did not mention their names. I did not lie. I just stated who had actually given me that loan. He said I was ungrateful, that they had given me a stable childhood, good schools, that they had set the foundation for everything I had. My mother appeared beside him like she had been waiting for her cue. She said I had aired family business in public and that it was disgusting. We went back and forth like that, voices getting louder even though I tried to keep mine measured. Then he brought up the hotel, the money they had lost for the sake of the family, and how all he had asked was a little help. Something in me snapped again. I said, with my voice finally rising, that they were the ones who chose to sink money into a hotel I had never been consulted on, that they had refused to lift a finger when I had come to them with a plan, and that the only time they had ever come begging was when their own decisions blew up. I said I was done being the backup plan they only remembered when they needed a check. I said my grandparents had been there when it mattered, and they were the ones who deserved the credit. It was not my finest moment. I was shaking, my chest tight, aware that the entire room had gone quiet. People were watching. My cousin was staring at her shoes. My grandmother looked like she wanted to disappear, but the words were already out, and I could not take them back. The rest of the night blurred. Some people tried to pretend nothing had happened. Others whispered in corners. I helped clean up, hugged my grandparents, and then went home and had the kind of ugly cry that leaves you with a headache for hours. I knew I had hurt them too, even if I had meant to defend them. The next morning, my grandmother sent me a message. She said she understood why I was angry, that I was not wrong about how things had happened, but that seeing the family fight like that at her anniversary had broken her heart a little. She asked me to think about whether my anger was worth tearing everything apart. I did think about it. I thought about it through sleepless nights and long days at the office, replaying every conversation we had ever had. I thought about being a kid who always felt second tier, about being an adult who finally built something only to watch her parents try to rewrite the story. I also thought about my grandparents, about how they should not have to referee grown adults in their 70s and 30s. I felt guilty and furious at the same time. What I did not fully realize yet was that my parents were not done. They were just getting started on their own version of damage control. I started hearing from relatives who suddenly had very strong opinions about my behavior, opinions that sounded suspiciously like they were reading from the same script. An uncle called me to say I needed to apologize, not just to my parents, but to the whole family, because I had disrespected the people who had raised me. An aunt sent a long message about how I had manipulated the grandparents emotionally into investing in my business, implying that I had taken advantage of their love. At first, I tried to correct the record. I explained what had actually happened, that the loan had been formal, that there were documents, that my grandparents had made their own decision. Some people listened. Most did not. It is easier, apparently, to believe that the quiet kid with the computers turned into some cold-hearted business shark than to accept that the golden parents might have messed up. The real mess started when the lies moved out of the family chat and into my professional life. One of our long-term clients requested a meeting to discuss some concerns. I went with my best, things are totally fine face on, expecting maybe some feedback about our last project or a question about pricing. Instead, they started asking these weird, carefully phrased questions about whether there had been any issues of integrity within the company leadership. They mentioned hearing things about family conflicts, about me pressuring elderly relatives for investments, about complicated dynamics that could reflect on our decision-making. In the middle of that conversation, he pulled out his phone and showed me a forwarded message with my father's name at the top and a wall of vague warnings about trusting me with anything sensitive. I knew immediately where it was coming from. The client had originally been introduced to us by someone who knew my father. It did not take a genius to connect the dots. I did my best to shut it down, explaining the actual story, offering to show redacted copies of agreements. But there is only so much you can do when poison has already been poured into someone's ear. They finished out the contract and then quietly did not renew it. On paper, they just changed direction. In reality, we had been smeared. I was furious and terrified. Losing that client hurt in a way I could feel on every balance sheet. They had been one of our top 3 accounts and a big part of the stability we thought we had finally built. But more than that, it made me realize my parents were willing to hurt my business, not just my feelings. I confronted them over text, because at that point I did not trust myself to stay calm on a call. My father denied everything, obviously. He said he had only shared concerns as a parent, and that if anyone made business decisions based on gossip, that was not his fault. My mother doubled down on the narrative that I had used my grandparents. The stress spilled over into the company again. My partner, the one I had fought with during that payment crisis, finally lost it. She said she could not keep living in a soap opera where every few months some new drama threatened the work we were doing. She said she respected me and believed in what we had built, but she was exhausted by the emotional whiplash. We had it out in the office again, but this time there was less yelling and more cold resignation. A few weeks later, she told me she was leaving, selling her share, and moving on. We negotiated the exit cleanly. Later, after the court case was over, she sent me a short card that just said, "Glad you won this." We never rebuilt the friendship, but there was no bitterness between us. It hurt, but it did not break us. I redistributed the workload, promoted someone who had earned my trust, and kept the company steady long enough for the next season to feel normal again. I felt like everything was collapsing at once. I started seeing a therapist, not because I suddenly had a deep belief in mental health journeys, but because I needed an hour a week where someone would listen to me without picking a side. Even she raised her eyebrows when I laid out all the ways my parents had inserted themselves into my life, even when I had tried to build something separate. Around that time, I made a choice that felt both petty and absolutely necessary. I blocked my parents on every app. I blocked their numbers. I sent one final message, long and careful, saying that until they could stop lying about me and stop trying to sabotage my business. I did not want contact. I said I would stay connected to my grandparents, but I was done pretending we had a normal parent-child relationship. Then I hit send and immediately felt both relieved and sick. About a month later, my grandfather died in his sleep. No long hospital stay, no dramatic goodbye. Just one morning where he did not wake up. My grandmother called me, her voice small and shaking, and I drove to her house with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they hurt. Grief hit me hard. When my grandmother called to tell me, I could barely breathe. The funeral was big. He was one of those people who had quietly helped a lot of others over the years, and they all showed up to say goodbye. My parents were there, of course. We did not talk beyond a stiff nod. The air between us felt like glass that could shatter if someone breathed wrong. I focused on my grandmother, on the logistics, on making sure the ceremony went smoothly. I coordinated with the person leading the service, sorted out details with the place handling the reception. It was easier to be busy than to sit still and feel. After the funeral, there was the whole horrible process of dealing with paperwork and wills and assets. I knew my grandfather had left some things in order, but I had no idea exactly what until we sat down in this office with shelves full of boring folders and pictures of generic landscapes on the walls. The lawyer went through the list calmly, explaining what went where. There were some savings, some small investments, the house my grandparents had moved out of, and another property that made my throat tighten when he mentioned it, the old lake house. My grandfather had inherited that place long before he married my grandmother, and the title had stayed in his name the whole time, so it was one of the few properties that actually moved through his will instead of automatically rolling over to her. The lawyer explained it carefully. My grandparents had structured their assets years ago. The lake house was not treated as shared marital property like their other houses. It could be passed through his will. It was not about cutting my grandmother out. It was part of an asset plan they had agreed on with their lawyer years earlier. That house was the backdrop of half my childhood memories. Summers spent falling off the dock, winters staring at the frozen water, family weekends where the grown-ups drank and grilled while we ran around half feral. I had not been there in years, but the thought of it being sold to strangers made my stomach twist. When the lawyer said it was being left to me and one of my cousins, I felt a sharp, complicated mix of grief and gratitude. I also felt my father stiffen visibly next to me. He had always talked about that house like it was his future retirement project. He had plans for renovations, for renting it out, for turning it into some profitable escape. Hearing that it was going to me and a cousin instead of him was like watching someone get slapped without anyone actually moving. His jaw clenched. He did not say anything. He just stood up and walked out of the room before the meeting was even finished. I stayed. I listened as the lawyer explained the conditions, the shared responsibilities, the options. My grandmother squeezed my hand. She said quietly later that my grandfather had wanted me to have something that could not be taken away from you with a rumor. She said he had chosen that property on purpose. I thanked her, but inside I was bracing myself, because I knew my father was not going to let this go. The next few weeks were a blur of grief and logistics. I spent nights at my grandmother's new apartment, making sure she ate, answering calls, helping her sort through clothes and old papers. My parents hovered at the edges, polite but glacial. One afternoon, in her kitchen, my father cornered me. He said, in this calm but furious tone, that the lake house obviously should have gone to him, and that the logical thing would be for me to sign my share over, or at the very least to agree to sell it so he could manage the proceeds properly. I told him no. I said I was not selling it, not signing anything, not handing it over for him to flip or mortgage or do whatever brilliant plan he had in mind this time. I said it had been given to me and I intended to keep it, even if I ended up just using it as a quiet place to sit by the water and breathe. His face went red. He accused me of turning my grandparents against him, of playing the victim until they felt they had to compensate me. He said I was destroying the family. A few months after the funeral, I got a call from the lawyer again. My father was contesting the will. He was claiming that my grandfather had been influenced or manipulated, that he had not been in his right mind when he made some decisions. Seeing those words in writing about a man who had been sharp and intentional until the very end made me feel physically ill. The idea that I was being painted as some scheming granddaughter who had twisted her grandfather's mind to get a house was almost funny in how far it was from reality. Almost. At the same time, my parents escalated the smear campaign. I started hearing about posts in community groups, not naming me directly, but describing a certain business owner in the data security world who used family money obtained through questionable means. I saw screenshots of messages my father had sent to people in our town's business circle, warning them to be careful doing business with me because I was emotionally unstable and vindictive. It was not just about the house. It was about punishing me for not staying in my assigned role. I reached a breaking point. I sat down with a lawyer, laid out everything, showed her messages, screenshots, the timeline. She listened, asked questions, and then said very simply, "You have grounds to respond." Respond, in this case, meant filing my own legal action for defamation, documenting the ways their lies had cost us clients and put my company's reputation at risk. It felt surreal, sitting in a sterile office talking about taking my own parents to court, but at that point, it also felt like the only language they might finally respect. The next months were exactly the kind of thing I had always wanted to avoid. Legal paperwork, hearings, back and forth between lawyers, statements under oath. I was careful to keep the focus narrow. I was not trying to sue them for emotional damage or childhood trauma. I was addressing very specific lies and very specific financial harm. On the inheritance side, my grandmother's testimony and the lawyer's documentation were clear. My grandfather had been of sound mind. He had known exactly what he was doing. On the defamation side, messages and posts that had seemed petty and annoying suddenly became exhibits. It was exhausting and humiliating and weirdly clarifying. Some relatives pulled away completely, not wanting to be in the middle. Others quietly admitted they understood why I was doing this, even if they wished it had not gone so far. My mother played the devastated parent card wherever she could, talking about how heartbreaking it was that her child had dragged the family into court. My father stayed cold, convinced he was fighting a righteous battle to defend his legacy. In the end, after nearly a year of filings, testimony, waiting, and 2 sets of lawyers quietly reminding my parents how bad it could get for them if they pushed it, the decisions were not dramatic. My parents' lawyer had made it pretty clear that dragging things out any longer with the evidence stacked the way it was would only get more expensive for them. There were no slow claps or dramatic confessions. The court upheld the will. The lake house remained split between me and my cousin Mark. He was my father's nephew, and when I called him about it, he said he did not want to be dragged into more family drama. He agreed to sell me his share within a month, fairly and quickly, and we both walked away from that deal relieved. I used a mix of savings and a small loan secured against the property to pay him, and for the first time in my life, there was a piece of land with my name on it where I could actually breathe. My father's attempt to claim undue influence fell flat in the face of actual evidence. On the defamation side, we reached a settlement that included a written public retraction of specific claims posted in the same groups and threads where the original insinuations had circulated, sent directly to the same business contacts he had messaged, and coverage of my legal costs. There was no confession of guilt, of course. There never is with people like him. But there was a line drawn in an official, undeniable way. The real punishment for my parents did not come from me, though. It came from math, the debts from the hotel, the guarantees they had signed, and the loans stacked on top of bad decisions finally caught up with them. They sold their big house, downsized the business, watched their credit vanish, and my cousin, who had been pulled into that disaster, cut contact for a while out of sheer shame. People sometimes ask me if I feel vindicated, seeing all that. I do not know if that is the right word. There is some dark, ugly satisfaction in knowing I did not cave, that I did not hand over the house or write a check just to keep the peace. There is also grief. I lost the idea of parents I had been trying to hold on to, the version of them who might someday wake up and realize how much harm they had done. That version does not exist. What I have instead is distance, boundaries, and a lake house. I go there sometimes, alone or with a couple of close friends. It is not glamorous. The furniture is outdated, the dock needs repairs, and there is a damp smell in the closets no matter how many windows I open. But when I sit on the porch and look at the water, I feel something I did not feel much growing up: calm. I remember my grandfather's voice telling me to just do the work and not stop when it got hard. I remember my grandmother's tired laugh. My relationship with her is complicated now. She loves me, but she also loves her son, and she has to live in the same small town where everyone has an opinion. I drive over most weeks to have coffee at her kitchen table and fix whatever little thing she says is broken. She asks about my work, listens when I talk about deadlines and employees and risk, and sometimes she squeezes my hand, looks at me and says she is glad I paid back the loan, and tells me she is glad I stood up for myself. I do not have a neat ending for this. There was no dramatic reunion, no tearful apology where my parents suddenly understood everything. There was no moment where I forgave them, and we hugged it out in front of a sunset. They are living their life, downsized and still convinced that they are the ones who were wronged. I am living mine, running a company that survived both the health crisis and the family war, with scars that I try to wear instead of pretending they are not there. If there is anything close to peace in all of this, it is the simple fact that I stopped begging to be believed. I stopped presenting my case like a teenager with a slideshow. I stopped waiting for them to see me as something other than the weird kid with the computers. I built something anyway. They tried to rewrite the story, and I told another version out loud. I lost some things I thought I needed, like the fantasy of a supportive family. I kept the one thing that matters more than I knew: the right to decide what I will and will not sacrifice for people who only show up when there is something in it for them. That is the whole messy truth. I am not trying to be anyone's hero or villain. I just stopped playing the role they wrote for me. Then there were the people who avoided the topic completely. They would invite me out, talk about work, dates, bad bosses, whatever, and never once ask about my parents, like they were afraid mentioning them might make me cry in public. Sometimes I was grateful. Other times I wanted to grab their shoulders and say, "You are allowed to ask. It is my life, not a scandal you are going to catch like a cold." But I did not. I just let the gap sit there, another invisible thing in the room. My grandmother kept walking that tightrope only she seemed willing to balance on. She would call to tell me about a new recipe she had tried or some neighbor drama, and then her voice would soften and she would say things like, "Your mother still loves you, you know? She just does not know how to show it." That line always made me want to laugh and scream at the same time. I would answer something neutral, like, "I know you are in a difficult position," because I did know. She was caught between the child she had raised and the grandchild she had watched grow up in the shadow of that child's choices. Eventually, she asked if I would be willing to see her at the lake house. She said she wanted to go there one more time, while she still felt strong enough to handle the stairs and the drive. I said yes, partly for her and partly for me. I wanted to see what the place felt like with her there, not just as a refuge from everything, but as a piece of the life she had built with my grandfather. We went on a mild weekend when the weather was trying to decide if it was done being cold. I picked her up, packed snacks, blankets, the good coffee she liked, and we drove mostly in comfortable silence. The closer we got, the more her stories started to spill out. She pointed out a turnoff where my grandfather used to stop and buy fruit from a tiny stand. She laughed about a summer when a storm had knocked out the power, and they had all slept on the living room floor. When we pulled into the driveway, she sat there for a minute just looking at the house. He loved this place. she said, more to herself than to me. I got out, helped her up the front steps, and unlocked the door. The smell was the same as always, that mix of wood, dust, and a hint of lake that seems to seep into everything. She walked slowly through each room, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of picture frames, the worn banister of the staircase. We made coffee in the old kitchen, the one with cabinets that really should be replaced, but that I secretly liked just the way they were. We sat at the table and she pulled out a folded piece of paper from her bag. For a second, I thought she was about to show me some new legal document, and my stomach clenched. Instead, it was a letter my grandfather had written a few years before he died, the kind of thing he had tucked away, just in case. It was not a will, not anything official, just his handwriting on lined paper. She handed it to me and said, "I think you are ready to read this now." I unfolded it carefully. His handwriting was a little shakier than the notes he used to leave on the fridge, but still completely his. He wrote about the day I came to his office with my business plan, about how he had seen that look in my eyes that he recognized from his own younger days. He said he knew it would cause trouble with my parents, that he expected them to be offended, but that he trusted me to weather it. He wrote that the house by the lake was not a prize or a compensation, but a way of saying that he believed my life would extend beyond the family drama, and that he wanted me to have a place to breathe when the rest of it felt too heavy. I read the letter twice, then a third time. My grandmother watched me with this quiet, tired tenderness that made my throat ache. "He did not want you to feel like you took anything," she said. "He wanted you to know he gave it." That distinction mattered more than I expected. It did not erase the ugliness of the court case or the posts or the accusations, but it put a small, solid truth in the middle of all the noise. I had not stolen anything. I had received something that was deliberately, thoughtfully given. We spent the rest of the day there talking about everything and nothing. At one point, she admitted that part of her still wished I had found a way to fix things without taking it to court. I told her that if there had been another way, I would have crawled through it. She nodded and said she believed me. That was as close as we got to mutual understanding, and it was enough. After I drove her home that evening, I sat in my car outside her building for a long time, just scrolling through messages I would never send. Drafts to my mother, trying to explain for the 100th time how her silence had hurt more than my father's shouting. Drafts to my father, pointing out every hole in his logic and every lie he had told about me. Drafts to cousins who had chosen sides based on whatever version they heard first. I deleted them all. I had said everything that needed to be said, at least in the spaces where it mattered. Life kept moving, because it always does, even when you feel like it should pause and put a spotlight on your personal disaster. The company grew again, slowly but steadily. We hired people who had no idea who my family was, who judged me based on my decisions at work instead of the rumor mill. I started mentoring younger women who were trying to get their own consulting work off the ground, and every time I talked to them, I heard how often families confused protecting you with holding you back so we feel safe. I never used my story as a motivational speech, but it lived under the surface of every piece of advice I gave. Every once in a while, my parents tried new angles. A short message sent from an unknown number, clearly my mother's words, asking if I was finally done punishing them. A mutual acquaintance bringing up how time heals everything, and suggesting that maybe I should be the bigger person and reach out. One relative went as far as saying, "You know they are not getting any younger," as if age automatically washed away responsibility. I listened, I nodded, and I held my line. I had not gone through court, therapy, financial risk, and public humiliation, just to slide back into the role of the dutiful daughter who makes everything easier for everyone except herself. I would sit on that porch and let the water do what my family never could, which was stay quiet. My parents never apologized, but they also do not get to narrate my life anymore. I remember something my grandfather told me in that little office when this was all just a plan on paper. Do the work and do not stop when it gets hard, and that is the story I am choosing to live.